message here at Crossroads Christian Church. Hey, a couple of things. Well, first of all, let me just say, we pray that you all are doing well. We also would like to tell you, maybe don't say this enough, but we really, really miss being together. And so, and I know that you all do too. And so, one of the things that we're going to begin to really encourage is that if you're a part of a road group, that you all maybe consider to begin meeting again in person. I know some have been doing it through Zoom and by other means, but one of the things that we want to encourage is that we begin to fellowship together and to draw into that maybe smaller community, because right now we can do that. So we really want to encourage you to do that if you can, and if people a part of the group are not susceptible. So that's one thing we want to encourage you to do, because what we're experiencing, I've been talking to some shut-ins, and they're really kind of experiencing just even depression and frustration from not being able to basically have human contact. And so we want to encourage you guys to begin to meet together and to have the fellowship that we're meant to experience as the church. The second thing I want to do before we get into the book of Exodus is to express appreciation to. We had several people come out. Some young people came out today, and some older folks came out today to help us pack some boxes. Tomorrow is the first day of what we want. It's a food drive that we're trying to accomplish for 4 of our county schools, and so tomorrow we'll be serving the Westville community through the school there, and then also Oakwood. And so thank you to those who came out to be a part of that. Now, with that being said, I'll take just a moment to explain kind of the purpose of this and where it came from. I had some conversations with individuals in these different school districts, and so one of the things I found out was that during the summer, they're not able to continue to provide meals and things like they were during the school year. And so I just started thinking about our food pantry and the benefit that it might be. And so what we've done is we've selected 4 of the area schools, county schools, and a part of it has to do with that they have people here as a part of our congregation. And so those districts are Westville, Oakwood, Catlin, and Bismarck. And so we are going to be serving 80 families twice a month. And the goal is to serve them all summer. And so we're putting together a box of food that we hope will last them for 4 or 5 days or up to a week. And so 40 families a week, 2 school districts a week is the goal. And so we just need help. Part of the way that you can help is through the food drive for it. You can go to our Facebook page and see the list of the items that we are providing for these kids and for these families. And so if you want to contribute in that way, we'd really encourage you to do that. A second way to contribute, because we also are providing some perishable foods, milk, eggs, butter, hamburger, that sort of thing. You could actually help us out by donating to our benevolence fund. And so that's another way that you can do that. We also are really promoting people being hands-on with it. If you want to come and help us pack the boxes, we're doing that on Wednesday at 2 o'clock. And then again on Thursday morning, we're actually gathering the perishable things and getting them in the boxes. And then our goal is to deliver to these communities by 1 o'clock on Thursday. And so even if you would like to go and maybe experience delivering some of the food to some of the addresses, The schools have certainly been open to that. You could also help us out because we have to shop for some of these things. And this week, our staff had the pleasure of going down to Aldi's and doing that. However, we're inviting you, if that's something that you would enjoy doing, going shopping for some of these items, absolutely. All you've got to do is contact the church office and let us know, and then we will give you instructions on how to be involved. All sorts of ways. And so just a big thank you to those who came out today to help us out. And so the whole purpose in this is just simply to point towards God. And I think we'll drive that home in the last part of our lesson here today, that's the end, that's the chief end of what we are to do. It's to make the name of God great. And so we thank you for being involved in that. And we really encourage, if you haven't, plugged into that, check out, I put an article in the reminder. Check that out. It explains things a little bit better, a little more in detail. And then as well, check out that food list that we've posted on Facebook. And just thank you in advance for your involvement. So we're in the book of Exodus. We're beginning the book of Exodus. And the word or title Exodus is actually a Greek word that comes from the Septuagint. Now, to explain that, the Old Testament scriptures were written in Hebrew and some Aramaic. And in a day and age when everything was changing over to the Greek culture, Greek was becoming the universal language, some scholars translated the Hebrew and the Aramaic into Greek, and that's what we refer to as the Septuagint. And sometimes you'll see it abbreviated as LXX. So if you're ever reading a commentary or something like that, or you're reading a book that refers to the LXX, that's referring to the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint. And Exodus is a Greek word which means exit or departure. And the departure in this case is the description of God's people, the Hebrew people, leaving their homes in Egypt. That's where we left off last week, that they had settled in Egypt. And if you remember, even in Abraham's covenant with God, God had said to Abraham, your people, your descendants, will be taken into a land that they do not belong in, and they will be there for 400 years, a period of 400 years. And then I will bring them out and take them back to the land where they belong. And so the departure, the Exodus in this case, is the description of God doing just that, taking them out of their homes in Egypt and moving them to the promised land. And so this book is about the fulfillment of God's promise to deliver his people from their bondage, to make them into a mighty nation, and to take them to a land of their own. The first 6-7 verses tell us and remind us again that there were 70 who went into Egypt and settled there. And by the time the Exodus takes place, I mean, estimates, it depends on who you listen to, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 3 million people who come out. Some say it's a little less than that, but there's a great number of people who Moses leads out and takes them to the land that belongs to them. Now, while Exodus is the Greek title for the book, the Hebrew title is derived from the first 6 words of the text. And so if you'll look there, this would be the Hebrew title. These are the names of. And these are the names of. That's literally the title for the Hebrew, or the Hebrew title for the book of Exodus. And these are the names of. To simplify that a little bit, the word that's used there that expresses that phrase is Shemoth. And so Shemoth means, and these are the names of. That same phrase, by the way, you might remember is used in Genesis 46:8, where it likewise introduces the names of the Israelites who entered into the land of Egypt. And so that's just a brief introduction to what we're going to be talking about tonight. And I know oftentimes when we're dealing with an overview of a book, some people are just not really into that. But I feel it's necessary as we enter into a new book of the Bible that we understand some things about it. And so one of the things that we'll look at tonight is the authorship itself. Who wrote the book of Exodus? And most of you probably understand that it was Moses, okay? And that's because of several occasions in the book where Moses is instructed to write these things down. And so as the screen is telling you, it's universally accepted that the author of Exodus is Moses. But I wanted to just share just a few places, and you can jot these down if you're someone who takes notes. In Exodus 17:14, Moses is told to record Israel's victory over the Amalekites. And so Moses, is told, write this down, that you guys whipped up on the Amalekites. Moses is also instructed to write down the Ten Commandments. That's probably a given. You probably know that, but that's in chapter 34, where God says for him to write those things down. And then he also wrote down everything the Lord had said, which included the book of the covenant. And the book of the covenant in Exodus, it begins in chapter 20, verse 22, and then it goes through chapter 23, verse 33. And in the book of the covenant, it's simply talking about the things, the way that the people of Israel should live. And there's lots of do's and don'ts in there, but that section is referred to as the book of the covenant, and that's chapters 20, verse 22 through 23, 33. And then there are several New Testament. There's some outside reference to the fact that Moses wrote the book of Exodus, because there are several New Testament authors, individuals, who refer to passages from Exodus as the book of Moses. You'll actually see that phrase, as Moses said in the book of Moses, such and such. And so there's some outside or some external evidence that Moses wrote the book of Exodus. Now, there is an interesting theory, and I just want to share it at this place. There's a theory that the book of Exodus was never intended to be a separate writing. That basically many have believed that it was meant to be an extension of Genesis. Now, personally, I see that regardless, especially with the first 5 books of the Scriptures. I see them as extensions of one another. They belong together, and we even group them together in that way as the law or as the Torah. And so even if it's titled differently, personally, I do see it as being an extension of the story. It's the next part of God's story for delivering his people. And so that's the authorship. It's accepted that Moses is indeed the author of the book of Exodus. Now, the date kind of serves in a way to be kind of a little bit hard to nail down, but as you see, it's generally agreed that the year of Israel's departure was 1446 BC. And here's what we know. Since Moses returns to lead the Hebrew people out of Egypt at the age of 80. He's 80 years old when he goes back to be there for God to deliver them through his leadership. And so we know that the book of Exodus was written within the span of his 40 years of leadership, because Moses dies at the age of 120. So sometime during that 40 years, he is writing. And let me just throw this in there. We've kind of determined that Moses was probably the one who wrote the book of Genesis as well. And so he's writing down the things that God is sharing with him. But the official date is dependent on the date of the Exodus itself. And so the issue there is that there are a couple of different theories concerning the exact date, and it has to do with who the pharaohs were. Which pharaoh did this happen under? But as we've put out there to you right now, it's generally agreed that the year of Israel's Exodus was 1446 BC, or somewhere in that neighborhood. All right, so now I want to spend the rest of our time talking about the theology of the book, because there are really some pertinent things that we are taught through the book of Exodus about who God is, about what God does, about how he arranges things. And so the first point of theology is that there are detailed descriptions of God's nature that are offered in chapters 3, 6, 33, and 34. And so we learn about his nature. For example, those include the significance of his presence. Now, I just want you to think about that for a moment. How significant is God's presence in your life, in our lives? How significant is his presence here for Israel? From what I understand about the book of Exodus, and as we get into it, we'll see this, there is a great plea coming from God's people unto him. God is hearing their prayers, but the issue is the people are not experiencing his presence. They feel distant from him. And that doesn't mean that he is distant, but in their situation, in the situation of bondage and slavery, the cruelty of it, and we're going to see some of that. We're going to see some abuse that takes place of these people of God. And so they're at a place where they're not feeling God's presence. I don't know if you've ever been there. In fact, I will tell you that loneliness and depression, that oftentimes when we're dealing with that, and please understand this, we have people in this congregation, we have people in the church, we have individuals, and whether they're in the church or outside the church right now, they are experiencing that kind of loneliness and being overwhelmed, and they are dealing with depression. And so we need to be praying for them. We need to be praying for folks in our church who are in those situations where they cannot leave their rooms, their apartments, or their homes. My goodness, so many people I think right now are experiencing the fact that they are kind of imprisoned, maybe even in their own homes. I know we live in an area where it may be a little bit better. Our situation may be a little bit better than that, but I'm just telling you, there are people who are experiencing. And so the subject, the significance of God's presence, and I know a lot of times people say, well, you always go to the 23rd Psalm, but it's so important, folks, to remind yourself that God is there, to remind yourself that God provides. And that's what David does. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. And he guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And then David says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Because God is with me. And I think that's such an important aspect. And the book of Exodus presents that thought and that idea of God's presence. And it also highlights other attributes like God's justice, I mean, look at how he deals with the nation of Egypt, with Pharaoh. His faithfulness. I'm reminded in the book of Exodus, there's an occasion when God says, man, these people are so obstinate, I'm not going with you anymore. And Moses says to God, well, if you're not going, I'm not going. But God isn't going anywhere. Why? Because he's faithful. And so, some people teach he relents. I kind of personally understand it in this way. He was never intending to leave in the first place, because that's not who he is. His justice, his faithfulness, his mercy is highlighted in this book. His truthfulness. He lays forth for us in the book of Exodus his standard, God's standard. And then obviously that truthfulness is driven because God is a holy God. And so another attribute that's talked about in the book of Exodus is his holiness. So there are some descriptions of God that are pretty significant throughout the book of Exodus, and we'll explore those things as we go along. Well, then God is also confirmed as the Lord of history throughout the book. I love that phrase, the Lord of history. And the example, the illustration I would use is this, that God deals with Pharaoh and he presents an example of his sovereignty, that he's perfectly in control. And he does that from the plagues. I mean, through the plague. One of the stories I remember is that Moses' staff, which was actually Aaron's staff, and Moses was using it. At one time, he put that staff down, and it turned into a great serpent. And then Pharaoh's magicians did the same thing. They caused their staffs to become serpents. And yet, what the story says is this, that Aaron, the serpent that came from Aaron's staff, ate the other serpents up. All right, God's going to show that he's in control, whether it be from the plagues or that incident I just described, even down, and I want you to hear this, even down to hardening Pharaoh's heart. And in that case, I mean, that's who our God is, and we've got to understand that. He has the capability of going into a person's heart and hardening it towards him. It's not a surprise, really, because we read in the New Testament, Jesus said, some just can't hear because they're prevented. They are being prevented from hearing by God. Now, why do it sounds so negative, but here's what I want you to understand about that. What God is doing is he's showing that he is the one who's perfectly in control. He is sovereign. And so why is that pertinent in our time? Because of the things that are going on around us. I mean, this whole pandemic, and then the issues since the killing of George Floyd, and so all of these issues, and as a Christian leader, I have a responsibility to constantly be pointing people to the fact that God is still in control. There are evil things that happen here. There are evil thoughts and intentions that people have, and there are evil thoughts that sneak into each one of us. And we need to understand that our God is capable. He is capable of keeping us from those things because he is the one who's in control. Robbie just talked about on Sunday how we have a responsibility to renew our minds. And how do we do that? We listen to the one who counts. And he gives us his guidance right here. And he's gifted us with his own spirit to allow us not only to be convicted, not only to have the capability of repenting, of turning around, but also of being wise. And I'm going to talk about more of that on Sunday. Making wise choices, using wisdom before we speak. If God can enter Pharaoh's heart and harden it, if God can turn the ears off of people to prevent them from hearing the truth, then he has the capability of entering into us and of changing us, of sustaining us, uplifting us. He's the God who's in control. And that's an important part of this book as we go through. Yahweh is also described as being the one who remembers. And Yahweh, of course, is the name for God. He's the one who remembers. 400 plus years have passed by, and God keeps his promise. He remembers his people. He keeps his promise to deliver them from their afflictions, to deliver them from slavery, and to lead them back to the place where they belong. He's a God who cares. He's a God who remembers. Man, that's so important for us to know that he remembers our need. He remembers the fact that you and I have a need to be redeemed, to be renewed, and so he doesn't forget us, and he didn't forget his people here. So we'll look at that aspect as well. And then there's a strong theology of deliverance and salvation throughout the book. The verb redeem, for example, is used in chapter 6, verse 6, and also in chapter 15, verse 13. That idea of redeeming. The kinsman redeemer is kind of a thought throughout this book, that God is our kinsman redeemer. He is the one who's willing to step in and be responsible. He is the one who is willing to pay for us to be redeemed, to be brought back to him. And it's God who steps into that role. Now, those mention redemption, verse 6, or chapter 6, verse 6, and chapter 15, verse 13. But the heart of the redemption theology, I think, is best seen in chapter 12, which is the Passover story. And just in brief, with the Passover, the families of each home were to gather together. They were to slaughter a lamb, and they were to cook that lamb and consume that lamb. And there were some other things that were involved. Bitter herbs and unleavened bread was a part of the Passover meal. But more importantly, they took the blood of that lamb and they put it on their doorpost. They put it upon the door so that when the death angel came later that night, the death angel would see the blood. And I was just talking to Mike Kilgallen about this over the weekend. Actually, he was talking to me about this. And he said, Miles, what we don't understand sometimes about the Passover is that God did not allow the death angel to look inside the house. Had no idea of the number of people there, had no idea of the condition of those people, but all that he was allowed to do was to look, and if he saw the blood of the lamb, then the death angel was to pass over that house, to leave it alone. And so redemption is truly seen, that the redemption has nothing to do with the individual. Don't misunderstand that. It has everything to do with the individual. But when God provides his redemption, what he looks for is the blood of the lamb. And that's what he sees when he looks at one of his followers, one of his disciples. He sees the blood of his son. And so great story when we get to it. And then also redemption theology is also seen in chapter 24, which is the sealing of the covenant. The sealing of the covenant. I want to just read a portion of it. Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel are all called to come within a distance of the mountain. But Moses alone is to approach the Lord. And so I want to just read from verse 4, which says, Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in bowls, and the other half he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people, and they responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." And once again, the covenant is sealed by blood. And so those are all pictures of God's hand of deliverance, his salvation. They're pictures of redemption. And so over the next few weeks, or if we're going to be honest with it, the next few months, maybe, we will be looking at themes like that throughout this book. Well, then also, the book of Exodus tells us how we should live. The very foundation of biblical ethics and morality is presented to us in the book of Exodus. It's God's standard, and God gets to set the rules. He gets to say, this is the way our conduct should be. And why should our conduct be like that? Because we are created in the image of God, and God is holy. And so we should live in a holy and righteous way. In fact, biblical ethics and morality, they're presented to us in a couple ways in this book. First of all, in God's own character. We probably don't say this enough, but God alone is holy and righteous. And you may be a person who lives pretty well, but here's what I can tell you: you are a human being. And what that means is that you are not perfectly holy and you are not perfectly righteous. In fact, we wouldn't be holy and righteous without God's presence in us. And quite frankly, sometimes God's presence doesn't show through us. And so we've got to go back and say it again. He alone is holy and righteous. And because he is holy and righteous, he gets to make the rules. He makes the rules. He has that right because of who he is. And so we have a responsibility to live as God instructs us to live. I don't think we talk about that point enough. This book isn't just something to read and study from if it's not going to make a difference in who you are. I was listening to Tony Evans today, and he made this statement. If you preach a message or you teach a lesson and you don't go out and prove that lesson in the way that you live, in the way that you serve, in the way that you love, in the way that you speak, then all you offered was a speech. It was just a speech. It wasn't a sermon. It wasn't a biblical lesson if it doesn't make a difference in you. And so please understand, you can read through this book and you can learn about ethics and morality, and then you can live completely contrary to it. But God says we should live in his character. And then a second way he presents ethics and morality is through the Ten Commandments. These are the rules right here. Or in the book of the covenant, as I mentioned before, the end of chapter 20 through the end of chapter 23. The book of the covenant. Those are his rules. Now, as we get into it, we'll learn that some of those rules were specifically for the Jewish people, and some of them no longer apply. But God lays out morality and ethics in this book. Well, then finally, the book of Exodus presents the theology of worship. And I want to spend a little bit of time here because we've recently, as we've gone into Romans chapter 12, we have learned that our spiritual act of worship is the way we live. It's in everything that we do. It's not just when we gather together here and we sing these songs. That's not what worship is. It's everything. In fact, in the book of Exodus, worship is expressed through the building of the tabernacle. And later on, it'll be the temple that is built. But the building of the tabernacle was time-consuming, okay? It took up their effort. I mean, it cost them in their effort. It cost them in value. Very, very expensive and ornate things were used to build the tabernacle. And so you could step back and say, why did God do that? And even with the temple, why were there inlays of gold and all of these things? Because all of that was to point to the glory of God. The work that they put into it, the effort, the time that they committed to it, the things that they gave towards it to support it. And we could say the same thing today. It's part of the reason that it's the reason for our service. It's the reason for our work and our effort that we put into things. It's the reason for our giving. Why? To bring glory to our God. And that's what worship is. And so the building of the tabernacle takes up a specific point in this book. And the whole point of it, the time that's spent, the effort that's put in, the cost of building it was all to point to the glory of God. And why? For all of us, that is the chief end of who we are. Because, folks, the all-powerful, the unchanging creator of this universe, he makes a choice. He made a choice thousands of years ago. He made a choice at the very beginning. As he created us, he knew that we would fall, and he put into motion a plan of redemption. He chooses to fellowship with us. He chooses us. He chooses to love us, to carry us if need be. He makes this choice to have fellowship and spend time with us. He lives in us. And so our primary task in life is to make his name famous, to point to his glory. It's part of the reason that I've asked, these school districts, if someone asks, don't tell them that it was Crossroads that did this. Simply tell them it was the church, and that's purposeful. The purpose behind that is to say, we want to point to our God and to the hope and the promise that he brings, the peace that he can bring to a person's life. He is the one who matters. It's part of the reason that we ought to choose carefully the words that we use. When we're correcting someone, when we're trying to encourage someone, just to be careful with our words. It's part of the reason we sometimes look at our opinions and really ask the question, do our opinions really count in some of these areas? Because the answer to that is no, they don't always count. They don't always matter. So we bring that into God's presence and we ask, is this God honoring? We could keep the list going. It's not just with opinions, and it's not just in those areas that I just spoke about briefly. It's about the whole of our life. How do we spend our time? What are our actions towards other people, including other people who don't agree with us, or including other people who've wounded us in some way? Do you not understand that the scriptures teach that even in those moments when we have been wounded by someone else, our responsibility is to forgive? Why? Because God has forgiven me. And so this book talks a lot about worship. Talks about everything that we do is meant to point to Him. In fact, one of the sad things in the story of Moses as we go along is he came to a point one time when he failed to point to God's glory, and it cost Moses the opportunity to enter into the promised land because he made a poor choice and he pointed towards his own glory instead of pointing towards God's. Folks, I don't think we can say enough about that. God came and He chooses to be in relationship with us, to fellowship with us. And so our task is to brag about that. Oh, not to brag about the relationship that we have with Him, but to brag about the God who is so above us. I mean, He transcends all of His creation, and yet He reaches down and He takes us by the hand and He offers to lead us in this life. Our goal and our task should be to brag on Him. And unfortunately, that's not always what we're seeing. We become so self-serving and so self-centered instead of allowing fellowship with Him to transform us into His image, into His character, into His love, into His peace. I know I don't normally close in prayer, but I just ask that you bow with me right now and we just spend a little time praying before God. Father, I thank you that the description of your word, this book, the Bible, in the book of Hebrews, we're told that it's living, that it's active. And so, Father, as we go through the book of Exodus, may it come alive. May it come alive in us, that we understand. Oh, we understand that we don't live by the law. We've been rescued from the law. But Father, we have an opportunity over the next couple of months to look at this book and to understand who you are, to look at your character, your attributes, and then to look at the fact that you do not forget us. You have not forgotten us, that down through the ages, think of Abraham and the promise that's made to him. You're going to have many descendants, and in his end, in his death, that had not been fulfilled. And yet, you're a God who remembers. Because by this time, hundreds of years after Abraham, and even hundreds of years after his death, you remember his descendants and you rescue them. And so, Father, down through time, this picture in the book of Exodus is so much a picture of your plan, that we understand that we wait for you, and we know that you will be faithful. And you were. Down after Israel is delivered and they brought into the promised land, and then down through the centuries, through the kingdom of Israel, the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah, through the Babylonian captivity, all the way down to the birth of Jesus. And then he grows, he becomes a man, the perfect man. And he dies on a cross in our place. You are the God who remembers. And then, Father, this past Sunday was Pentecost. And what I'm reminded in Pentecost is the book of Acts chapter 2, and Peter steps out 50 days after the resurrection, and Peter delivers a message. Well, first of all, the Spirit's poured out. And Peter says, hey, these men are not drunk. It's too early in the morning. But what's happening before you is what the prophet Joel talked about, that the Spirit would be poured out in the end. And you gave us the gift of your Holy Spirit so that anyone who believes, who confesses who you are and receives you into their lives and is baptized, not only has the remission or the forgiveness of sin, but we have the gift of your Spirit. You choose to fellowship with us, and this book talks about that. It is living and it is alive, and may it come alive in our lives as we study. And may it not just simply be about knowledge, but Father, may it be about a change of heart, a renewing of our minds, because we have filled it with your truth and with your righteousness. This is what I pray tonight in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, God bless you. We look forward to seeing you soon. I will end with this. We have a team that we put together that we're working on a plan to be able to bring us back together soon. And we are looking forward to that day. And we will continue, just so you know, we'll continue to have live feeds. We'll continue to put this out on YouTube, because we understand that there will be some who are still apprehensive about coming back so soon. And we won't condemn anybody on that. We just want to provide and be able to feed you the truth with grace and mercy, with boldness. And so we just look forward to being able to fellowship with those who are willing, and we're working on that plan. So God bless you. Have a great evening, the remainder of it, and we will see you soon.